I just watched the most hopeful webinar imaginable. But first, I want to mention that last night I slept really well. I had a dream that I was talking quite sternly with the psychiatrist who over-medicated me last April. I remember that. I don't really remember what I was saying, but I might have had some pretty strong words. And I don't remember that I was being rude. I was just quite upset with the way I was treated. And along those same lines, in a way, this webinar was about the antidote to a lot of this. A lot of what I've talked about with myself and self-dialogue in terms of the system and troubles and problems in the system would largely be eliminated if what they were talking about in this webinar was implemented on a wide scale. The trouble is it's implemented on a very, very tiny scale in the United States, and they were talking about it, and without further ado, the webinar was on self-directed funding in mental health, and they already have it in some other healthcare sectors in the United States. 1.1 million people are using self-directed funding, meaning there's a certain amount of funding one would get if one had a certain struggle or diagnosis or what have you, and then the person, with the help of a broker, can create a plan and put funding towards what one would like to participate with in terms of how they're going to get better. And that could be almost anything. And they didn't talk too much about examples of what that might look like, but they did in the webinar. It's a Mental Health Commission of Canada webinar. It'll probably be on their website soon. And there is a website called selfdirectedmentalhealth.org, and it's not even live yet apparently, but it's going to be about this. And what I loved about it is every single thing they said I completely resonated with, and that doesn't happen that often. It happened when I listened to the Peer Movement in Mental Health course by Emma Bragdon on her Integrated Mental Health for You website, and even the last webinar I listened to about social enterprise and mental health. Just some of the way people spoke kind of rubbed me the wrong way. And I even asked the question in the webinar, just by typing it, about whether a person has to be taking medication to access this self-directed funding, if it was ever available. And the 1.1 million people who are using self-directed funding in the United States, only 1,000 people total are people with mental health diagnoses as their primary concern. So someone might be an elderly person with self-directed funding and have a mental health concern, but they're accessing the self-directed funding through the fact that they're a person of elderly age range at this point in time. So this whole idea of self-directed funding is very new and very small. And I remember actually reading that Australia is doing stuff around this, and New Zealand, and I didn't know that the United States was doing anything like this. So I kind of feel like in 5, 10, or 20 years, this self-dialogue with myself, having to hide coming off medications or having to do it without support, and that's something I was just talking about. And in the webinar they were mentioning, with the right support, anyone can self-direct. Meaning, you can't just say, here's your money and go self-direct, but if a person's really supported, they will be able to put together a plan and utilize funding in order to move towards recovery, if you want to use that word, in the exact way that they want. So in my example, I'm actually thinking about if I was to create a sort of self-directed something for myself, even though I'm not going to receive any self-directed funding. I'm already doing things that are self-directed for my own so-called recovery. I'll use that word for now. So going to California for 5 months is part of that. It's living the dream I had before I ever was diagnosed with anything. And taking hearty nutritionals with the vitamin C and the amino acids, which is costing me probably about $200 a month right now. Maybe I would actually get funding for that, because that is my choice about how I would like to support my biochemistry and not taking medications. And it sounds like in this self-directed model, I would have that kind of support financially. I would have that kind of support in terms of the people around me. They would be supporting me to reach my goals, which are to be off medication for as long as possible. And if I ever have to go back on it, make it as short as possible, and then work again towards not being on it. Not saying, oh, well, since you had to go back on it, that means you have to be back on it forever. I don't agree with that. So the people speaking in the webinar were really positive and really sounded like they knew exactly what they were talking about, and talked about all the positive outcomes that are happening with self-direction in terms of the studies. And the studies aren't perfectly meticulous studies or anything, but they're saying threefold increase in things like employment, housing, and something else. But quality of life is so much better. Of course it is. If somebody's given an amount of money to create something that they understand will work best for them, of course the outcome's going to be better. Than you should go to this group, just do whatever program and take these meds, and you don't get any money for anything that you think would help you. So you can live in poverty and just get by and have these services that we've created out of some kind of evidence base. But where does that even come from if it's not coming from the people that live through it? So hopefully self-direction would also include helping people taper off if they want to, and a person being able to utilize a naturopath or something to help taper off, or using these micronutrient support lines such as Hearty Nutritionals and EMP. And perhaps part of what I can have a dialogue with myself about in this next while, something that actually got me kind of going, was talk about things that I include in my own self-direction without the self-directed funding, and talk about other things I've tried in the past and things that I'd like to try if I maybe had the funding, and sort of paint a really big picture of possibilities, so when self-directed funding does come in, we're already talking about it. Imagine if we're already talking about what we would do if we had self-directed funding before it even comes in, and just getting in that mindset that we really have a right to design our own path to wellness. And if each person gets, I don't know how much money a year for healthcare in mental health, and they get a clinician, a social worker, an occupational therapist, a rec therapist, a mental health worker, clubhouse services, medications, a psychiatrist, a clinician, maybe we don't want all of that, and all those things are so expensive. And if we could just take a small portion of that, or half of that, and actually put it towards something that we would be excited about reaching and moving towards as a hope and a dream, or a goal, if you want to call it a goal, then of course that's going to help a lot more. So there was a multi-state study about self-direction in behavioral health, and there's a Florida self-directed care approach, and it's about choice, recovery, independence, identifying your own goals for changing your life with adequate support. And they said everyone with support can self-direct, and everyone is unique and knows what's best for them. And that's a basic premise, along with everyone can self-direct with support. And to me, that's just so brilliant. And that's my basic point too with this whole coming off med thing, is everyone is unique and knows what's best for them. And I knew those extra drugs, and that being drugged up on Seroquel wasn't best for me last April, and I was right. Here I am over a year later, haven't been back to the hospital, haven't taken daily high doses of antipsychotics. I was taking them for probably 2 months at a lower dose here because I'm in California and I can't really risk getting out of control. But now, because of that, I have tapered off with the help of Hearty Nutritional Support and their micronutrients. And right now it has to be a big secret. And maybe one day this will just be natural for someone to choose something like micronutrients. And if I had self-directed funding, I would probably do a lot more for my wellness. I would definitely divert some of the funding that I've gotten towards clinicians and things like that, towards things that actually would increase my wellness and increase my happiness and help me reach my goals in life. And doing that is going to be the buffer for anything that, if there are any kind of reoccurrences of any kind of troubles, if I have a good life going, it's going to make it that much easier to get back to or want to get back to. And I've said before when I share my story sometimes is, for me, recovery is like a mountain, because it's like building a mountain. So if I build a nice mountain of a life and I tumble down to the bottom, I just have to climb back up the mountain. I don't have to rebuild the whole mountain. So it takes a bit to climb back up the mountain, but I've already built this mountain of a rich life that is something to want to get back to. And that's not the only factor, that's oversimplifying it, but it just made me really excited to hear this webinar, because I know that that is exactly what would have helped me. And I feel really lucky I've managed to come through everything that's happened the best I can, and I'm still stumbling, living my dreams, and considering what the next will be. But I'm just really hopeful about this for people, and maybe even for myself one day, if I still am within the system. If self-direction comes in, that would be very helpful in being able to create that which I understand will help for me as a mode of getting well. And not just getting well, but becoming a whole person and experiencing wholeness. And they said it's based on people's strengths, preferences, goals, and it's a creative and flexible plan. And they said people have an individual budget, using some of the money towards traditional services, allowing a person significant creativity in their life goals and how to reach them. So diverting some of the money that would go to traditional services and treatments to creating one's own plan and goals, and purchasing services and things that will help one move towards a goal that a person has self-identified. And to me, that's just brilliant. I didn't even hear a single word in this webinar that I didn't like. And even if they said recovery when they're talking about all this other stuff, that makes sense to me, because recovery as one would want to live sounds like recovering a life that one would want to live. But recovery in terms of just take these drugs and go to this place and go to this group, and that's the recovery that you get, is not good enough. And that makes that recovery word sound awful, because that's what the recovery is. It's what people have designed and selected for a person, and that's not it. So it's the same word, but used in a completely different systemic framework. It has completely different meaning. And in terms of the brokerage support, a lot of times they are training peers to do that job. And I could imagine myself as some kind of brokerage supporter, helping people to really reach their dreams and goals. So perhaps this next while I can think about what my dreams and goals are, and almost create a self-directed plan, almost pretending that I would get funding, but I won't, but to almost experiment with what they're talking about, knowing that that will come along one day for people. So maybe people have an idea of what that might look like. Just talking about some of the great things that might be available, and just assume that self-direction will eventually come in, even if it's in 40 years. it's just so amazing to me to imagine that some of the money that one would get for traditional services could be instead used for non-traditional services. And I'll definitely listen to this webinar again. It was just so rich and full of awesomeness. And they even said it's different from a medical model of case management. It's more of a coaching thing. And I've said to people in the mental health field a few times over the years that I feel like I need a coach. I don't need a clinician. I need a coach, someone to really help me move towards a life that is really amazing, because that's what's going to keep me out of hospitals. And if I'm living a good life, then I assume that once mental health will be better. And they said peers can be support brokers. There's a national resource center for participant directed services. And they even mentioned hiring and firing the worker of their choice. So if a person has a worker and they don't resonate, they can just fire that worker and find another one. And to me, that's so important, because there's a lot of studies out there that relationships are the number one predictor of whether a so-called treatment will be helpful. If a person has a relationship with their psychiatrist and takes medications, the medications are more effective than if a person doesn't have a relationship with their psychiatrist and takes no meds. So it's more so the relationship. And I've experienced that so many times where it's really the relationships. So even when I'm talking about all this stuff in the mental health system, I have 99% great relationships in the mental health system, and that has been my number one strength. And they talked about how self-direction represents a culture shift. It's completely different, and they're doing research showing the potential of this model. So that's why I asked myself the question, what does this look like even before it's available? And what I've been doing with this self-dialogue is actually really talking myself through my own self-direction. And even working in mental health, if I was working in mental health in a system where people could self-direct their services and I was supporting that, I could work in that. But working in what it is right now, all of these things that I've talked about through this last journey in the year, they would just be obsolete. My conversation with myself would be obsolete if it was already that way. And can we insist on self-direction? Can we ask for it? It's already happening in other places, so why isn't it starting to happen in Canada? And can we as peers create almost a support network, so when there are support brokers, we already have this structure of services and products and all these different things that can help people. So can we create that so when it comes in, it's easy and we don't end up falling into allowing, say, if a clinician is helping us self-direct, they have a very narrow view on what could be helpful. And of course, it's supposed to be person-directed, so according to their goals, but it's always great to have a knowledge base of what might help a person move towards their goals. And they were saying in the webinar that the state of Michigan already offers the choice to self-direct, but not that many people probably know about that option, or even if they did, who knows if the people supporting that person would know how to do it, or maybe they have to be referred to somebody else to help them self-direct, or I don't know how it works, but some of the background stuff is actually in place so that people can actually begin to self-direct there. And they mentioned New York, and they mentioned some different things in the background that have been changed in favor of moving towards self-direction, but they just haven't really implemented it. So I wonder if I can create a network of people who would be in a self-direction network. So I get kind of excited about this because it's sort of like lifestyle design, and also being able to not just survive after having a mental health label, but start to be able to thrive. And I see this kind of model as really something that could facilitate that. So they mentioned their website, mentalhealthselfdirection.org. And I really feel if there was self-direction, there'd be no need for self-dialogue. I'm talking to myself about all these things that I'm self-directing, and not necessarily the context stuff. That's a little bit different. But even leaving the mental health system and going to California and then coming off meds, I'm self-directing myself, but with no support. And I was talking about that recently, how I'm alone. I have no support, so it's kind of risky. Whereas I'm not doing anything that would be outside the framework of this self-directed model. It's just the model isn't there yet, and I'm doing it ahead of the model. I'm not waiting for the model to catch up. So I wonder if I can do a self-direction study with my own money and my own resources. And really this self-dialogue is an experiment in self-direction. And I didn't know it was going to be like that in the beginning. So if I can do well directing myself without the help of anyone and do pretty well, what could people do when they actually have support in directing themselves instead of just following orders? They even mentioned some people use self-directed funds to start a business. And to me that's amazing, because I kind of want to start a business, but there's no self-directed funds. And I wonder if I could be a self-direction coach of some kind. And if self-direction works so well, can we do some form of self-direction and coach and support each other before the model actually comes in? Can we be more versed in self-direction as peers before we're even told about it by the mental health system? And can we put pressure to actually start implementing this kind of model before it is actually available? And they even mentioned people voting with their feet, leaving certain services if they don't want to stay in it, and some providers might feel kind of threatened by that. And they should. If the services suck and other things help more, then people can vote with their feet. And then I stopped taking notes on the webinar because it was just really amazing and really hopeful, and not necessarily that hopeful for me, because it could be 20 years before it's actually even beginning to be implemented. I would hope that it would be beginning to be implemented within a couple years and really firmly implemented in 20 years, or hopefully less. But that will kind of put me past it in a lot of ways. So what I'm saying is, since there is a spark of the system possibly moving towards something like that, that's sort of what I'm already doing, but without the system's help. I'm going against what the system would tell me to say, but in this new system, the system wouldn't tell me what to do. They would support me in doing what I feel is best for me, and being a creative agent in doing that, and also it being a fluid thing. So if I think one thing helps me this year and I want to try something else next year, well then I can. And that to me is really amazing. So I feel hopeful. I feel kind of like I can relax and just live my life because things are going in the right direction. So as much as I've said negative things about things I've experienced, I'm hoping nobody will have to even think about that happening to them in the next 20 years. And the thing that messes with me too, though, is the way society's designed, it guarantees that a certain number of people will get labeled with a mental health diagnosis. And imagine if we actually invested the money that people might get through the mental health services now, or even through self-directed services, and invest that in a child that's born, for them to self-direct their life, self-direct their education, self-direct everything, and actually move towards their dreams to begin with, instead of moving in the field of what we have created as this is what success is, this is what you should do in your life, this is what you shouldn't do. You go to school, you go to more school, you get a job, you get married, you have kids, you have a house, and so many people are following this cookie cutter approach and then feeling like, wow, I'm not living the life that I wanted. I'm this and I wanted to be that when I was young, and I knew it, and I didn't do it because my parents put pressure on me to do this, and then I cracked, and then I got a mental health diagnosis. Well, it's still, to me, investing in the problem that is created by the structure of society, and getting self-directed funding is almost a consolation prize for the failure of society's design to be diverse enough and rich enough to really facilitate the discovery of what each person is here to do in their heart, not just according to goals and status and all these things that don't matter when we're on our deathbed. So that's my one thing about the self-directed thing, even though I think it's 99.999% positive. And I still think that people will be treated poorly in the psych ward and drugged, and then have a harder recovery period, even if they get self-directed funding, because they're going to have to use a lot of the funding to actually undo the damage of the way one is received, traumatized, treated, and paternalized, and given this completely non-self-directed care, and slap with a label, and then said, oh, you're out in the community now you can self-direct your recovery and your treatment and your goals, now that we've labeled you and given you a rough ride and made it harder to actually recover. And maybe if a person's been in the hospital for a month on medication, maybe they're addicted to the medication, it's going to be very hard to come off. So with what I was talking about before, being on medication for more than a few weeks can make it nearly guaranteed that one will think they need it for the rest of their life, because the coming off process can be harder than what was happening before one goes on. So in that way, as long as the acute care remains the same, one's trajectory of recovery will still be warped and very limited because of the way that we're indoctrinated and put on these chemical drugs, and it's difficult to get off of them. So that would really require changes to the mental health acts and how one can be given forced and coercive treatment in the acute facility, and then again the self-directed care after is almost a consolation prize for that kind of justified, medically justified, apparently, supposedly, abuse. So it's still a step in the right direction, but we'll see if that ever changes emergency care, and maybe people knowing their rights to self-direction in the community might start asking for some kind of self-direction in the acute ward. Because if somebody knows what's best for them in the community, why is it that somebody doesn't know what's best for them when they're in a crisis? And maybe they don't know exactly what's best, but they might know what they don't want, and say that. And if it's not listened to, like I wasn't listened to a year ago, I was put on Seroquel, high dose, and I said, I don't want that, and I wasn't listened to, and I didn't have a choice. So now I would never go back there unless I'm dragged there in some way, shape, or form. Yeah, so that webinar was really exciting. I'm really excited because people are going to get labels for a long period of time still. And if one can have self-directed funding, that would make the process a lot better. And then hopefully one day there can be some kind of preventative element introduced, in that one knows as a child to move towards one's dreams, and one knows as a parent not to push a child to anything other than their dreams, even if it changes from day to day. It's really important to have self-direction in life from day one, and how can we really do that for one another? Can we be that creative? Can we be that fluid? And maybe that's what I can talk about more with myself too, is some of the things that led me to the point of getting a diagnosis, and how I might have prevented that. And yeah, so I can see from this webinar, and it's good timing, and it addresses a lot of things that I was talking to myself about. And I really see the need for self-direction, because this last year I've really actually gone completely self-directed, and here I am in California, so I'm doing really well. And if I would have taken the advice of that psychiatrist and just stayed on 800 milligrams of Seroquel a day or whatever it was, I would just be a zombie. And that would be the opposite of self-direction. That would be taking the direction of the psychiatrist and then probably gaining weight, vegetating, having flat affect, akathisia. It would have been just such hell. And even being put on that amount or nearly that amount for a few days put me so many steps backwards in my recovery process that I had to go self-directed. And the self-dialogue has been a conversation with myself about the self-direction. And even it's self-directed that I wanted to just talk to myself, because there are no clinicians or therapists, or I can't afford a therapist to talk to every day. So if I had self-directed care, maybe I would have someone else to talk to once a week or something. And I would be able to talk about my self-direction, not about following the directions of my psychiatrist and how my life is going based upon that. So this is really important, the self-direction thing. And I like that I'm already doing that and showing how important it is. And I like when I find out that something I've been doing in self-dialogue is important, and I find out why after the fact, or I'm able to put it in a new context by just learning about the self-direction. I'm able to see what I'm doing is self-direction and that it is helpful. And self-dialogue is self-direction, and it's also necessary because there is no self-directed funding for things like talking to supportive people or having different supportive services. And I've done so many things over the years that could have been part of self-directed care, and maybe that's something I could talk about too. Whether it's being on a completely raw vegan diet for a while, or taking the hearty nutritional supplements like I am now, or doing a 10 series of rolfing, which is a type of massage that helps with structural integration. So if the body's more in alignment, it's using energy properly, it's not wasting energy, it's not slouching and getting sort of contorted over time. And to me, that's important to have alignment. And it also feels good, and it feels good to be aligned. And it fixed my shoulder. I couldn't reach back behind my back and touch both hands on both sides, but after one session of rolfing, I could do it. So it really fixed something that was off. I've gone to see naturopaths. I've gone for colon hydrotherapy. I've done so many things, and a lot of these things increased my self-esteem because I was able to get rid of my gut that stuck out, and people kept asking me if I was pregnant, or different supplement regimes I was on over time, and just a lot of different things. So that's something I could do, is go through and talk about things that I've done for myself in a self-directed way and funded it myself. I bought an earthing sheet, which is something you can plug into the wall. I bought an earthing mat, so it helps keep you grounded and connected to the earth when on the computer or sleeping. I've done so many things for myself that would be considered self-direction that increase my quality of life, and a lot of those things could be reasons why I'm at this point and able to speak about everything that I've done. So yeah, I'll talk more about this, and I'm really glad I watched that webinar, and there's this new energy behind what I'm doing, and maybe I can move into some positive things, like actually just sharing more of what I did for the 5 years before I started talking to myself, because there was a lot of good stuff. And the thing that really bugged me and got me talking to myself was that all of that was nearly taken away from me by one psychiatrist in a hospital. And all of that self-direction I did on my own dime, working and different things that I did over the years, was almost taken away by one paternalistic psychiatrist trying to drug me up on Seroquel, which is not part of my plan for myself. So that plan of that psychiatrist almost ruined all my plans, all the time, energy, effort, sweat, work, money I put into all my self-direction by myself, for myself, was almost ruined. So that's what spurred this conversation. And a lot of it spurred the conversation in terms of re-languaging and recontextualizing the experiences. So if anything came back, I would have that context to fall back on instead of falling back into the trap of a kind of doctor like I had in the psych ward last April. And not all doctors are like that. I had one before that in the same psych ward twice who gave me a bit of extra meds for a week and sent me on my way. And that was very helpful and it was amazing. But then when I went back to the hospital that third time and expected the same sort of thing, different doctor, completely different result. So I knew better because of the times I'd been in there before and how I was able to get back on my feet very quickly. And I won't accept anything but that. And so now I'm just doing things on my own in the way that I want. And that's why I've spent a year talking to myself about all this different contexts and ways of seeing these altered states. So yeah, that's a lot of words, but I'm seeing that now in this next year, I want to move towards some kind of altruism, but maybe also talk more about the things that I did in the 5 good years. Now that I'm off meds, now that I feel a bit more safe in the stability of my consciousness, because that's important right now while I'm in California, I can talk about some of these positive things and positive things I did for myself. And maybe that's part of the altruism, and it would be good to just imagine that one day things will be self-directed and that context creation will be helpful, but also knowing things that one can do for oneself to self-direct. And maybe that's something I can do in the next year too, is just work towards getting the word out about self-direction to some people in the different health authorities, get that word out there and at least get people thinking about it. And maybe acting like that will just be how it is. Maybe helping people self-direct now. If somebody wants to come off meds and that is a self-directed thing they want to do, help to find people supports to be able to do that before having to wait 20 years to come off a medication that is going to destroy one of our organs. So for some of us, we can't wait for self-direction to actually come in terms of self-directed funding. But can we demand self-direction now in things that we're not necessarily going to get funding for? Like, we won't necessarily get funding for hearty nutritional supplements. But if we really value that and are able to get some money from our parents or work a little bit of a job to pay for it, or we have some savings, or we have something or other, being able to self-direct that choice. So yeah, this self-dialogue has really been an experiment in self-direction, not just in terms of doing what I want to do in terms of so-called recovery goals, because my life has actually been less about that in the last year than it was in the years prior, because in the years prior I was working more and I was actually able to use a lot of my money to purchase things that were part of my goals, whether it was supplements or different types of things like naturopaths and stuff. But in the last year, since that bad psych ward experience, I tried to quit peer support, and I didn't fully quit. I was just doing some work in the background. And then I got a different job, which I talked about at length as a coordinator and of a peer program, and I quit that to go to California because it really didn't resonate with me. And I wrote a resignation letter, and I could read that because probably some of the stuff I talk about is about the lack of self-direction, even if I don't use those words exactly. And so I probably will read that kind of next, because I think I want to get saying the slightly negative things out of the way and move on to something else, move on to this positive building of thriving. And coming to California was my attempt to thrive, and I didn't quite thrive, but I went into a dive of going off my medications. And actually, now that I'm off, I'm actually more equipped to thrive because I don't have all that toxic stuff that I feel isn't good for me running through my body. And so I really want to move more into altruism, attempt to thrive, self-direction, and maybe talking more about self-direction before the funding comes in, and just really getting people's brains thinking in terms of that and how we really can direct our lives. And one day there will actually be the funding to back that up. And that's the thing. I really feel like through moving through this kind of crisis, whether it's labeled mental illness or whatever, one can really move into the life of one's dreams. Because one of the things I talked about was how part of the mental health crisis to me feels like we're so far away from our original trajectory of life that we sort of designed before we were even born. And I never said that, I don't think. And I'm not saying that's how it is, but we have a design in our nervous system of what resonates with us. And each time we move towards something that is not resonating with us, we move further away from our true self, our light body self, our original unwarped trajectory of life. And I feel like the crisis is sort of snapping us back to our original trajectory, and then back to this awful trajectory we're on. And it's like an earthquake between the original trajectory of life, if we were never warped away from what we were meant to be by society, our parents' education, our own decisions that might not have been best for us, but we're acting on information being outside of the wrong situation in life due to the path that we'd walked along, due to all those influencing factors. So it's a vicious circle, but I feel like the crisis can allow us to get back onto the path of who we really are. And if self-directed funding comes in, that can really facilitate that to be true. But in the meantime, we can still move towards self-directing the best that we can. And maybe we can actually start some kind of self-direction thing and support each other and self-direct, knowing that that kind of thing works, even though we don't necessarily have the support and backup from the system. But can we help each other with that? And maybe just in me talking to myself about these things, in these ways that I have always really been self-directing in most ways, maybe that will help. I don't know. It sounds more positive than creating context and saying a lot of the negative things that I have been for the last year, because the last year has actually been the most negative since that psych ward experience. Before that, I actually didn't really have that much negative stuff to talk about. And so maybe I should share more of that part of my story. So yeah, I really don't know, but I really do feel quite excited about that webinar and the implications of that. And even just having that give a little bit of context to maybe what I want to do with this dialogue, as well as with myself, and in helping people moving forward if I can be of service in any way. But also, upping my own self-direction and moving into thriving for real. And if I can move into thriving for real and then share this, it could really show something, because right now I'm still not quite into thriving. I would like to start a peer-run business, some kind of social enterprise, thrive, create myself as a healthy being, physically, mentally, spiritually, and I'm fortunate that I have been able to do that so far, and I have been able to learn so much. So I wouldn't change a single thing that I went through that was bad, especially the last 2 years. I was in the hospital 3 times. One of them was a complete disaster. I experienced a lot of seeing things that were happening in the system, subtle things that were re-traumatizing and really bothering me that were happening to other people, and and seeing that same psychiatrist treating somebody else that I know and how terrible they're doing, and there's just a trend there, and it's just really painful to witness. And even being away from home right now, feeling like I have this time to heal, but if I don't go back and actually make use of that healing in terms of still being able to share the stuff that was hard, and make use of that, and share the wisdom in that, then the healing is for nothing, because my personal healing just for me doesn't really mean that much. I'm just one person. I'm just a person that won't be here forever. And what's important is to support each other and form relationships and support each other in these different ways. And yeah, I gotta go, but I'll talk to myself more about this later. I feel like now I have a lot to talk about.